Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really getting into Ukrainian intelligence. We're taking a close look at the Security Service of Ukraine, the SBU.
Yeah, we've gathered quite a few sources on this one. The goal is to really understand what the SBU does, where it came from, its structure, and,
Yeah.
what it's actually doing right now.
Absolutely. If you're trying to understand Ukraine's security setup, the SBU is just, well, fundamental.
We'll explore its start right after the Soviet Union collapsed, some of the internal struggles it faced early on, and how it's become the agency it is today, which is operating under, frankly, incredible pressure.
Right. And our aim, like always, is to give you a clear picture, the full story, but without, grounding you in details. Consider this your guide to getting up to speed.
We'll trace its path from those, let's say, unsteady beginnings
Yeah.
to its current role, right on the front lines, always keeping in mind that core mission: protecting Ukraine's independence, its constitution, its borders, and its citizens' rights from threats.
Okay, let's dive in then. Where does the SBU story start?
Officially, September 20th, 1991, that's when it was established, right after Ukraine declared independence.
Okay.
But, and this is really key, it wasn't built from scratch. It basically took over the structures, the people, everything from the Ukrainian branch of the Soviet KGB.
Right. So that direct link to the past and the leadership too.
Exactly. The very first head was Nikolai Glushko. He'd actually been the boss of the Soviet Ukrainian KGB just before that.
Wow. Okay. So a pretty seamless transition in some ways.
It was, and that really shaped how people saw the SBU at first. For a good while, it had a pretty negative image.
How so?
Well, there was this widespread feeling it was corrupt. And more worryingly, it got a reputation for arresting political opponents, intimidating people, very reminiscent of its predecessor, unfortunately.
So inheriting those old problems.
Definitely. It shows how hard it is for new agencies in transitioning countries. They often carry that baggage and need huge reforms to build trust.
That makes sense. A really tough beginning. So fast forward to 2014, the revolution of dignity. Sounds like a watershed moment for the SBU. There was a big restructuring.
Oh, absolutely. 2014 really laid bare some serious problems. Beyond just the corruption concerns, which were still there, there were really big questions about Russian intelligence possibly infiltrating the SBU.
Right, that infiltration risk.
Exactly. So this restructuring, it wasn't just moving a few desks around. It was a major effort to fix those weaknesses, to fundamentally change the agency. Like finding out your home security was compromised by an insider, you'd rip it out and start over.
Yeah, you wouldn't just tweak it. Okay, so after that shakeup, what are the SBU's main jobs today? What are its core functions?
The big one is counterintelligence. Think preventing spying, protecting state secrets. It's like a constant battle against foreign intelligence services.
Okay.
Then there's fighting organized crime and counterterrorism, both huge threats, obviously.
And it's interesting, the Constitution actually calls the SBU a military formation. What does that mean practically?
It means the staff are military personnel. They hold ranks. They operate under military discipline and law, to an extent.
Okay, not purely civilian then.
No. It probably reflects the sort of high-stakes, dangerous work they often do.
And it reports directly to the president, right? That shows its importance.
It's subordinate, yes.
Yeah.
Very high-level oversight.
Now, special forces often come up with agencies like this. Does the SBU have its own unit?
It does. The Alpha Group. That's their elite special forces unit.
Alpha Group.
And what's interesting is they have bases in every single province across Ukraine.
Every province. Wow, that's extensive reach.
To give them a nationwide footprint, yeah. Quick response capability anywhere in the country.
So let's talk size and structure. How does it compare to, say, the old Soviet, Ukrainian KGB, or maybe Western agencies like Britain's MI5 and MI6?
Well, some analyses suggest it's actually larger than the Soviet Ukrainian KGB was.
Really? Larger?
Yeah, which might surprise some people. And compared to the UK, it's reportedly significantly bigger than MI5 and MI6 put together.
That's a huge difference. Why do you think that is? Different threats, different structure.
Could be a mix of both. Ukraine faces, let's face it, very specific and intense security challenges right now, but it might also just be a different organizational philosophy compared to, say, the UK model. It definitely makes you think.
It does. So inside the SBU, what does the central structure look like?
The central HQ in Kiev has something like 25 departments. We know some specifics.
Like?
There's a main directorate on corruption and organized crime counteraction, clearly a major focus. The counterintelligence department, obviously crucial, it even has its own logo. And something called Department K, which also targets corruption and organized crime.
So a lot of focus on internal issues, corruption, crime.
Seems that way, yes.
Yeah.
Tackling those vulnerabilities seems to be a big part of the mandate.
And it's not just Kiev, right? You mentioned the Alpha Group bases. Are there regional offices too?
Absolutely. There are 26 regional departments, one for basically every region, plus a special department anti-terrorist center.
Right, for terrorism specifically.
Yes, and that center works really closely with other ministries, interior, defense, other state agencies. It shows how security is a collaborative effort there.
It sounds incredibly complex, a big organization. And presumably, they need to train all these people.
For sure. They have their own educational institutions.
Yeah.
The National Academy of the Security Service of Ukraine is the main one, plus an institute at the National Law Academy and others. Training new recruits, upskilling current staff, it's vital.
Okay. Any other key parts of the structure we should mention?
Well, there's military counterintelligence, keeping an eye on security within the armed forces. The state archives of the SBU are important too for history and analysis.
Right.
And as we said, the Alpha Group, they're special ops guys for the really tough situations.
It's fascinating seeing how this modern SBU is put together.
Sure.
But you mentioned history. Ukraine's had security services even before the Soviets, didn't it?
Mhm.
We should probably touch on that deeper history.
Definitely. To get the full picture, you need to go back further. The Ukrainian People's Republic, the UNR, formed way back after World War I. They actually set up their own security services, January 14th, 1918.
1918, wow. So right at the beginning of that brief independence, how did they function?
It was a bit stop-start. A later version of that government, the Ukrainian state, had a more effective intelligence service, apparently because they brought in experienced people from the old Tsar's Okhrana.
Ah, experienced hands.
But when the UNR was reestablished again later, its security services basically had to start from scratch and weren't as successful. It just shows how hard it is to build these things when everything's politically chaotic.
That pattern again. Instability makes it tough. What about Western Ukraine back then?
The West Ukrainian People's Republic had its own setup, pretty well organized apparently. It became the field gendarmerie of their army in 1919, sort of intelligence/military police.
Interesting. Did they work together, the Western and Eastern Ukrainian services?
No, apparently not, which just underlines how politically divided Ukraine was even then.
And even after those states disappeared, the intelligence efforts didn't completely stop.
No. In the 1920s, you had Mykola Chabotarov, who'd led UNR intelligence, trying to gather intel from inside Soviet Ukraine for the government in exile.
A long history of intelligence work.
Yeah.
And then the Soviets solidified control with the Cheka.
Right. The all-Ukrainian Cheka, formed in 1918, its job was basically to prop up the Soviet government there, fighting what they called kulak nationalistic banditry, essentially peasant resistance, and arresting political enemies like the Mensheviks.
Grim stuff.
And eventually, in 1934, it got absorbed into the NKVD of Ukraine, becoming part of that wider, infamous Soviet security machine. So yeah, the SBU's roots run deep through some very complex and often dark history.
Absolutely. Okay, let's shift to more recent times. The post-Soviet era, those key periods and controversies. Starting with the 90s up to around 2005, we touched on the bad public image. What specific events fueled that?
Well, there are some really troubling things. During the messy privatization of the 90s, especially in places like Donetsk, you had reports of the SBU actually working with local criminals to grab state assets. Not exactly upholding the law.
Not ideal, no.
And the Yuri Mazola case in 95 was horrific. He was arrested by the SBU in western Ukraine, tortured for days based on false murder accusations, and died in custody.
Oh my God.
Yeah. The real killer was caught later, and several SBU agents were actually convicted for Mazola's death, a massive human rights violation, and it really showed the critical need for accountability.
A truly disturbing example. Were there other big scandals in that early period?
There were pretty persistent reports in the early 2000s about SBU involvement in illegal arms sales abroad. That raised huge questions about oversight, you know? The authorities admitted some sales happened, made some arrests, but the shadow lingered.
Right. And then the mid-2000s brought some big structural changes. You mentioned departments splitting off.
That's right. 2004, the SBU's intelligence department became its own separate agency, the Foreign Intelligence Service of Ukraine, handling external threats.
Okay, so a split between domestic and foreign.
Exactly. And then in 2005, another bit became the State Service for Special Communications and Information Protection, Der Spetsvyazok, also separate.
But one part actually came into the SBU around then.
Yeah, confusingly, the Directorate of State Protection, the guys who protect top officials, formerly part of the KGB structure, was absorbed into the SBU.
And that directorate was linked to the cassette scandal, right? with Mykola Melnichenko recording President Kushma.
Precisely. Melnichenko wasn't SBU when he made the recordings. He worked for that directorate before it joined the SBU. But the scandal, which included allegations about the SBU chief Durkov and Russian mafia ties, led to the SBU investigating the murder of the journalist Georgy Gongadze, which the tapes brought to light.
So the SBU was right in the thick of these huge political storms. And General Kravchenko's accusations in 2004.
Yeah, Valery Kravchenko, the SBU rep in Germany, went public accusing the agency of spying on Ukrainian opposition figures, even German journalists. Major political interference claims. He was fired pretty quickly.
Wow. And the 2004 election? The poisoning of Viktor Yushchenko. The SBU was implicated somehow.
Well, the timing was incredibly suspicious. Yushchenko got sick right after having dinner with the SBU chief at the time, Ihor Smeshko. It added fuel to an already explosive political fire.
Understandably. What about the Orange Revolution that followed? Where did the SBU stand?
Officially, they stayed neutral. But it was murky. Some SBU veterans and cadets openly backed Yushchenko. And remember, Yushchenko, as a candidate, was actually under the protection of that SBU directorate we mentioned.
So internal divisions or mixed loyalties, maybe?
Possibly. And the outgoing chief, Smeshko, later claimed he'd stopped the regular police, the militia, from using force against the protesters, even threatening to use SBU special forces.
Did he really? Is there proof of that?
He claimed it. But there's no solid, independent evidence to back it up. You have to take claims like that with a grain of salt, especially in such a charged atmosphere.
Right, so that whole period really shows the SBU caught up in intense politics, serious questions about its role. Okay, moving into 2005-2010, Valery Karshkovsky becomes head. His tenure was controversial, too.
Very much so. He got public criticism from a university rector, had to apologize. There was that odd incident detaining a German political foundation representative, Nico Lange, though they called it a misunderstanding later.
But the bigger issues were about his business interests, right? Media ownership.
Yes, huge conflict of interest accusations. His wife's company owned a major TV channel, Inter. Critics said Karshkovsky used his SBU position to pressure rival channels, TV and Channel 5.
Not a good look.
No. Plus, links to that controversial gas company Rose-Ukrenergo and allegations the SBU went after its business rivals.
And he made some statements about the SBU's role that raised eyebrows.
He did. He said publicly the SBU's main job was protecting the president. Critics argued it should be about protecting the state, national security broadly, not just one person.
A subtle but important distinction.
Definitely. And even smaller things caused waves, like arresting a blogger in 2010 for a threatening comment about President Yanukovych. Free speech groups were worried.
Right, but at the same time, they were criticized for being too passive about Russian claims on Crimea.
Exactly. It seemed inconsistent. Then you had the activist group Femin claiming the SBU was intimidating them after Yanukovych won the election in 2010. Just added to the controversy.
Okay, so the next phase, 2010 to 2014, leading up to the Euromaidan Revolution. More issues.
Yeah, the hits kept coming, sadly. In 2012, the deputy head, Rakitsky, got snapped wearing this incredibly expensive watch way beyond his official salary. More corruption questions.
The perception just wouldn't go away. Were they doing any actual counter-spying, though?
They did once uncovering some foreign spies in 2009 and made quite a few arrests in 2011. So yes, some counterintelligence work was seemingly happening amidst the controversies.
But then came the Euromaidan protests in late 2013, early 2014. Things got really messy for the SBU then.
Extremely messy. As the protests peaked in February 2014, reports emerged that President Yanukovych ordered a massive destruction or theft of SBU files, hard drives, documents, info on agents, informants.
Trying to cover tracks.
Looks like it. Then an opposition MP released documents allegedly showing the SBU had deeply infiltrated the Maidan protest movement using various tactics against them.
Wow. And when Yanukovych fled?
The new SBU head, Valentin Nalivichenko, painted a shocking picture. Said the headquarters was practically empty, leadership gone to Russia or Crimea, files and weapons missing. And crucially, he claimed the agency was riddled with Russian spies.
A hollowed-out, compromised agency.
That was the claim. And indeed, his predecessor, Yakimenko, and other top SBU guys did turn up in Russia later.
Okay, so that brings us to the post-revolution period, 2014 onwards. Shaped by the war in Donbass, then the full invasion. How did the SBU rebuild and react?
It was a massive overhaul. Straight after the revolution, arrests of SBU agents, including the former counterintelligence chief, treason probes against Yanukovych-era officials,
Right.
all regional bosses replaced.
A real clean sweep attempt.
Yeah. By mid-2015, Nalivichenko claimed they drastically reduced that Russian infiltration. Started recruiting heavily from Western Ukraine using polygraphs, tough vetting.
But still, some problems persisted. Allegations against the SBU itself.
Yes, unfortunately. In 2015, reports surfaced that a deputy SBU chief actually supported the events leading to Crimea's annexation. And after the annexation, a fair chunk of SBU staff in Crimea left, though the exact numbers differ.
Okay.
More seriously, in 2016, Amnesty and Human Rights Watch published reports alleging secret SBU detention sites, mistreatment, even torture of civilians.
Secret jails. Alarming.
Very. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine also raised red flags about freedom of expression being squeezed, using broad laws against journalists, bloggers, and they mentioned credible reports of abuses by SBU personnel, including torture and sexual violence.
Those are incredibly serious charges, especially during a conflict.
Absolutely. It highlights that constant tension, needing security, but also upholding rights and laws, even under extreme pressure. Huge challenge.
On a different track, there were reports the SBU got more assertive in the Donbas conflict zone.
Yes. Around 2015, a new 5th directorate was apparently set up, and it's been linked, allegedly, to assassinations of prominent pro-Russian commanders in Donbas.
Cool.
Names like Alexander Zakharchenko, Givy Tolstik, Motorola Pavlov have been mentioned in connection with these alleged operations.
So taking the fight directly to them, and counterespionage continued, catching Russian agents.
Definitely. For example, in 2017, they arrested several Ukrainian civil servants, one from the SBU itself, accused of spying for Russia.
Inside job again.
Yeah. And other sensitive stuff, too, like those raids on Ukrainian Orthodox churches linked to the Moscow Patriarchate in late 2018, citing security concerns.
And the MH17 case.
Yeah.
The SBU captured someone important.
Right, Vladimir Tsemak. He was a key figure in the separatist air defense around the time MH17 was shot down. The SBU snatched him in a risky operation from separatist territory in 2019. He was seen as a vital witness for the international investigation.
A major intelligence coup, then. But the infiltration problem didn't entirely disappear.
Apparently not. In 2020, they arrested Lieutenant General Valery Shaitanov, a high-ranking SBU officer accused of working for Russia's FSB and planning assassinations inside Ukraine. Shows how persistent that threat is.
Okay, brings us to the full-scale invasion. February 2022.
Okay.
Unprecedented situation. What was the SBU's immediate response?
Intense counter-espionage, full tilt. Reports of capturing large numbers of Russian spies, collaborators, saboteurs trying to disrupt things.
And that reported cooperation with U.S. intelligence,
Yeah.
NSA, CIA.
Yeah, there were reports they worked together, maybe help break Russian encrypted communications. That's said to have yielded vital intel, possibly even leading to deaths of Russian generals.
Wow.
Plus, the SBU started releasing intercepted phone calls, supposedly Russian soldiers talking about low morale, admitting to war crimes. Very impactful public information warfare.
But there were some really dark and confusing incidents early on, like Denis Kryev's killing.
Yeah, that was tragic and messy. Kiryev was on Ukraine's negotiating team, killed by SBU agents in March 2022, initially suspected of treason.
But he wasn't.
Later, Ukraine's military intelligence, GUR, said he was actually their agent, killed while on a special mission for them. It really showed the chaos and paranoia of those first weeks.
What a tragic mess. And high-profile arrests continued.
Medvedchuk.
Yes, Viktor Medvedchuk. Hugely powerful pro-Russian figure close to Putin. He escaped house arrest, but the SBU caught him in April 2022, charged with treason. A big symbolic capture.
And then a leadership change at the SBU itself that summer. Right. Ivan Mukhanov, the SBU head, a longtime friend of Zelensky's, was dismissed in July 2022.
Why?
The official reason cited widespread failures, specifically treason and collaboration by SBU agents under his watch. Vasyl Malyuk took over, first acting, now permanent head.
A major shakeup mid-invasion. And the SBU has been linked to attacks inside Russia or occupied areas since then.
Numerous reports and claims, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The October 2022 Crimean bridge explosion is often attributed to the SBU, though not officially confirmed by them in that way.
Right, the plausible deniability.
Exactly. Also linked to targeted attacks, a Russian naval officer in Crimea, a GRU officer near Moscow. And then there are the more explosive, less confirmed allegations, like involvement in the killing of Daria Dugina in Moscow in 2023, a missile scientist named Mikhail Shatsky, and just recently, Igor Kirillov, head of Russia's chemical weapons troops, killed in Moscow in December 2024. The SBU doesn't typically claim these directly, but many analysts point the finger their way.
A very active, very aggressive posture, then. It's an incredibly complex story. Can you just run through the list of directors again quickly to get a sense of the turnover?
Sure. So Galushko, briefly, in 91. Then Marchek, Malikov, Radchenko twice, Durkak, Smashko, Turchinov, Dracheny, Nalivachenko also twice, Korshkovsky, Kalinin, Yakimenko, Hrytsak, Bakanov, and now Vasyl Mluk. Plus a few acting heads in between.
That's a lot of chiefs. Really reflects the political turbulence. And there's a presidential commissioner overseeing the SBU?
Yes, appointed specifically to provide some oversight, ensure they operate within the law, accountability mechanism.
Okay. And finally, they have service medals.
They do, like most security services, a way to recognize service, bravery, achievements, standard practice.
Okay. So wrapping this deep dive up, it's clear the SBU has been on a roller coaster ride since 1991.
Absolutely. Battling corruption, external influence, fighting for public trust, all while trying to do its core job. And now playing this absolutely crucial role in the face of full-scale war.
Its history really does seem to track Ukraine's own turbulent path to solidifying its independence and identity. The controversies, the reforms, it's the story of building institutions under pressure.
It really is. And it highlights those inherent tensions for any intelligence agency, especially one operating in such a high-stakes environment. Balancing security needs with rights, secrecy with accountability.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with a big thought to ponder. Given everything we've discussed, the SBU's past struggles, its current vital role, its sometimes controversial methods, what does its future path mean for Ukraine's sovereignty, for its place in the world?
And what are those ethical lines for an agency with such immense power, operating mostly in the shadows? How do you ensure security doesn't completely override liberty?
Really vital questions to keep thinking about as Ukraine's story continues to unfold. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.